in 1952, I was sitting in a coffee shop on Bleecker Street in Greenwich Village in New York when my first wife, Zina Rashevsky, walked in with 2 books. The 2 books that she had under her arm were SIDDHARTHA and On the Road. And she said to me, read them. I said, for what? She said, well, first of all, Jack Kerouac, who wrote On the Road, is here, living here. And he's outside and wants to meet you. And the second thing is, this book, Siddhartha, has influenced all the Beats. They think it's fantastic. So I really think you should read it. I said, okay, so I'll read it. In the meantime, she brought Kerouac in, and she said, you're going to love him. First of all, he's a drunk, and since you're also a drunk, you should have a great time with him. So we both moved to the local bar and proceeded to discuss his theory of writing, which basically was to get as high as he possibly could on Benzedrine, and then drink a few beers behind that, and then start writing. And he had great rolls of paper that he would stick into his typewriter, and he would listen to Charlie Parker playing his riffs and try and write as fast as Parker was playing the riffs. I, for one, wasn't that crazy about On the Road, but I was crazy about Siddhartha. I thought it was a wonderful book, and it had a certain mood that completely captured my imagination and also inspired me, I think, poetically, to try and write a bit like that if I could. Next time that I came in contact with this book was when I went to Zurich for some treatment, which was called Schlafen cure, and for cellular therapy. During the course of this treatment, which again was for drug addiction and alcoholism, I had the good luck to meet Hermann Hesse's son, Heiner Hesse, who lived in a colony not far from Zurich called Kuschnacht. And in Kuschnacht, the Jungian Society existed and the Hermann Hesse Society. And I asked him, I said, look, if ever I get a chance one day to make a movie, could I make a movie of Siddhartha, and would you help me get permission from the publishers to do it? And he agreed that he would help me. And subsequently he did. And ultimately, one day, way into the future, some 5 years hence, I ended up in India with my first wife and with my newly born child. He was about 4 months, 5 months old. And we landed in Bombay. And while we were in Bombay, we also met Shashi Kapoor, who's the star of Siddhartha, and his wife, Jennifer Kendall. And they were just a young couple hanging out by the swimming pool at this motel called Sun and Sand in Juhu Beach. At the same time, I met his brother, who was probably the most famous and most successful filmmaker in India. His name was Raj Kapoor. And Raj Kapoor had an enormous film studio that was all his, called RK Film Studio. And because I had met his brother at the swimming pool, he decided that he would show me around his studio. And while he was showing me around, they were shooting a film where he had at least 500 actors standing out on this set in about 100 degrees heat with lights, their makeup dripping off their face, and he was simply going on with me having this discussion and not even worried about them. I said, well, what about all these actors? He said, oh, so I'm not in the mood, he said. So he went back into this small office that he had. It was more like a study, and he was sitting up like a pasha on this platform. And the servant kept coming in, bringing him scotch and soda, and in the meantime, all these distributors showed up. And they're begging him to finish this movie that was outside. And they're also bringing him trunks of money, suitcases of money. So he was enormously successful. So I thought to myself, and I was 18 at that time, this is the thing for me, this is the life for me, I've got to get in the movie business. Think about it. I'll have all these guys delivering this money to me. I can live like a Maharaja in India. Wow, this is terrific. Well, that was the beginning of my real interest, not only in Siddhartha, but also in the film business. After that, my wife and I went, and we lived for 1 year in Sri Lanka, which was a Buddhist country. The first time we came in contact with a real Buddhist country. When we left Sri Lanka, we then went to Thailand, Siam. And in Thailand, again a Buddhist nation. And again a chance to see Buddhists actually worshipping the Buddha, to study more about Buddhism, and again to bring the Siddhartha myth into much, much sharper context, having seen Buddhism in actual practice. We lived in Thailand for a year. After that, my wife and the baby went back to America. I stayed on in Hong Kong for a while, and finally we all ended up back in America in Greenwich Village. And in Greenwich Village, we lived on a street where, at one end of the street, was Norman Mailer, the writer, and his wife, who was, as I remember, Puerto Rican. And there was a jazz club called the Village Gate, or Village Vanguard, which was at the other end of the street, Perry Street. And we were at the center of sort of all the action that was going on right then in the village. Lots of writers were coming by, poets, all the beats were in and out of the house, and there was a lot of activity. At that time, I had already met Ravi Shankar, and I invited Ravi to play at my house, or rather this apartment. We had a rather large apartment there, every Sunday. And Ravi was not doing that well. He wasn't making that much money, and people were not interested in the sitar at that time. This was prior to George Harrison and prior to the whole hippie revolution. So I started bringing well-known jazz musicians by to hear him, like John Coltrane, the men from the Modern Jazz Quartet, and other musicians, lots of them. And they were fascinated by the fact that Shankar was playing in a completely different tonal scale, with many more beats to the measure. And furthermore, when they heard the rhythms of Alaraka, which was the tabla, with these rapid pacing and so forth, it was like a unique awakening for these musicians. They began to think about changing their own time frame and scale, and also the method of Indian music to sort of go into what I would say is free motion. It's almost like the car when you put it into a certain gear and it runs on much less gas. You're floating. There's a time change, and there is an effect that can be created with the sitar where it changes even the time and your feeling of where you are. And this is a sort of unique aspect of the music, not only its age, because after all, it's a craft that is hundreds and hundreds of years old, if not thousands. It's also a religious activity. What he's doing is trying to get much closer to his concept of divinity through the music. And he's taught in this method, which is the Guru-Chela relationship, which again is the Siddhartha relationship. Siddhartha and his guru. His guru, of course, is the boatman. And the boatman is, of course, the Buddha himself. And the river is the river of life. And taking people back and forth across the river is almost like taking, across the river Styx, which you find in classical Grecian mythology. It's also reminiscent of Egyptian mythology, where the solar boat of the pharaoh taking his spirit across to the next existence, the next level of reincarnation. And this concept of reincarnation, which you find in Buddhist philosophy as well, is something that is a very living thing in Thailand itself today. Thais think in terms of their next incarnation. And they'll suddenly say to you something like, well, all right, you know, you better behave to that dog over there because that could be your uncle. And they really believe it. And so you start to think in a different context if you live there over a prolonged period of time. The same was true of what happened to us when we went to India to actually shoot this film. Even though I had been in India, I had lived in India, and I'd studied with a Swami for 4 years. So I not only felt that I had some understanding of the religion, Hinduism, but I also had some understanding of fasting, of meditation, all of the yogic positions, what they were supposed to do, opening the 1,000-petal lotus in your head, and so forth. So I had a pretty good grounding before shooting this film of what the film was supposed to try and attempt to tell, considering the amount of time that Hermann Hesse spent in India, which was, after all, something like 4 to 5 months in 1911. The 25 years I spent in India is certainly a lot longer period of time. And before I even shot Siddhartha, I had already spent 6 years in India. It is a big subject, and one that you can't master in one film. In fact, you can't even master it in one lifetime. So that's what India is truly about. It is a very ancient society, going back 10,000 years, with living traditions, which are still operative. And it is this sense of this eternity that you realize when you're out in the country and you're out working in India, as I was, where suddenly you realize that the past and the present and the future, they're all one. And it is this oneness, this unity, that I think Hesse touched upon, and magnificently. I mean, he had the ability to describe in the whole situation with the boatman and with the death of his wife and the snake bite. He had all these symbols that were there, which were to help us understand basically what Eastern thought is. And I feel that he did an excellent job, considering the fact that he spent very little time in India, and that he was writing for basically a German-speaking audience. And I think this is one of the reasons that he failed at the time that he wrote the book, which was 1922, to really reach the Germans. Because I don't think Germany was ready for him at that point, with that particular concept. Even though, strangely enough, he affected people like Heinrich Himmler, who happened to be fascinated with that book. In Himmler's case, it was all tied up with his concept of Aryan superiority and the Aryan race. It was a totally misconstrued concept of Siddhartha. But the fact that he read the book, as many Germans did at that time, shows me that they didn't quite understand what Hesse was trying to get at all. And I think the reason for the renaissance in Siddhartha and this film, which after all I made and completed in 1972, is the fact that with each successive generation, say 2 or 3 generations or 1 generation later, the film still has some meaning. And Hesse has some meaning, because there is a sort of universal approach to the whole work. It's in the poetic context, the imagery is poetic, the style is poetic, slow. In fact, it's a bit, high camp, or there's something to it that makes you think, well, really, is he serious? You know, can I really relate to this? But you certainly can. And the fact that I shot it entirely with Indian actors was something that, why didn't he have Peter Fonda as Siddhartha, and so forth and so on. And the reason was that if you couldn't do it in the actual land of the Buddha himself, with people that looked like the people the Buddha moved with, and with situations that were very much like situations that he would have come in contact with, then the film is, and the message of the film is ununderstandable. It's not a Hollywood message. If anything, it's the opposite of Hollywood. And of course, when you do something like that, you may find yourself in a very peculiar trap. The trap I found myself in was I was enormously successful in India with this film, and not so successful in my own country, which I made the film for. So I was in the unique situation of finding that my film appealed to the Indians far more than it appealed to my own countrymen. And that was a shock to me, because then I had to completely change my thinking. It also meant that I had fallen deeply in love with India. I would say that there were two major hurdles in shooting in India. The first was to get permission from the Indian government, and also, thanks to a relationship that I had with the Gandhi family, and knowing Mrs. Gandhi well, and also her son Rajiv, I was able to get her to think about letting me do this. This film could only enhance the knowledge that the average American has of India and make them realize that it's an ancient culture and a beautiful country. And she had enough intelligence to grasp the PR implications of the film, particularly because she was a graduate of Rabindranath Tagore's famous college and school, Shanti Niketan, and she understood very well Tagore, having read all of his poetry. And in fact, I used Tagore's poetry on the soundtrack. The music is all Tagore, and it's sung by one of the greatest exponents of his work, Hemant Kumar, who is famous in Bengal for singing Tagore. So there are many aspects of this film that are interesting. One, the fact that Tagore won the Nobel Prize for his poetry, and Hermann Hesse won the Nobel Prize for his literature. So you have two Nobel Prize winners' work being put on the screen. I think probably the biggest block that I had was the war. When we were on location, suddenly the Indian-Pakistani conflict burst into a full-fledged war. And for 3 or 4 weeks, while the war raged, we were all locked up in a hotel under martial law. This hotel was in Delhi, and it was called the Maidens. It was not the Oberoi, but it was owned by the Oberoi. It was slightly out of town, and it gave us a chance to rehearse and to clean our equipment and so forth. But it was also a nightmare for me as the producer, because the cost of keeping this crew eating and drinking and doing nothing for 4 or 5 weeks was very, very much an overrun, a budget overrun. And I was desperate to get started again. And finally, during the course of this 3 weeks, one of my production managers came in with the Maharaja of Bharatpur, who we wined and dined, and he then said, look, one of the problems you're going to have with shooting in India is the population trying to touch Shashi Kapoor, who at that time was India's biggest star, and a living god as far as the masses were concerned. You couldn't put him on the street without causing riots. And so Bharatpur offered me the use of all his private hunting grounds, palaces that were very far out, that people had never seen because they were private property, and also a marvelous bird sanctuary, which was called Bareta. And we shot in all these locales, and it gave a special flavor to the film. It gave a feeling of what indeed it must have been like in India during the time of the Buddha. And the film is supposed to have sort of a timeless no particular place, showing that India is timeless in many respects, even today. However, I doubt seriously that you'll ever see India as it was in Siddhartha, because many of the places that we shot in now have billboards, advertising, have completely lost their charm, will never be the same again. And I'm very happy that I had the opportunity to make this film and catch that part of India which was about to disappear. While we were staying at the Maiden's Hotel, I had people scouting, looking for various types that we could use. For instance, Buddhist monks. So we actually found an ashram of Tibetan Buddhist monks. Because they were Tibetan, I had to go see the Dalai Lama. And I had to ask for his permission to make Siddhartha. I wanted his blessing, and I wanted to be able to use his monks, which I did. And he did give his blessings, and he was an absolutely wonderful man. A man who could read your mind, a man who was really the personification of Tibetan Buddhism. Kind, generous, nice. And it was a great thrill for me to meet him, and I understood then why he's called His Holiness. He is indeed a holy man. Speaking of holy men, we also heard the most extraordinary music being sung, which were Hindu bhajans, which are sacred slokas, which are recited in rhythm and usually sung by a band of 9 blind men. And they had a timbre in their voice that I guess only the blind could possibly have. There was a sort of aching of their soul that came through in the voices. And these men would have to go, one with a hand on the next one's shoulder, in order to not stumble into something. And they were led by one of them who could see, or could see enough to lead them. And they were just going like this, on foot, around northern India, and being fed by the local population, who loved to hear them sing. They were an inspiration. So I thought, well, why not put them in the film? And in fact, most of the things that ended up in the film were just people that I found as we were moving about India, who I felt in some way personified the story. So I was using contemporary India, in a sense, which is timeless. And whatever we found material, which in another way is a beat cinema. It's a way of being free with it, where you are actually filming reality, but you're making it appear on the screen as non-reality, and maybe possibly you are finding reality through all of this process. So it's an experiment in that way. And in many ways I think it works, because there's a certain energy there. And this energy is transferred to the audience. Nyquist, who I was fortunate enough to get interested in making this film, was interested because he loved the book. I didn't have to sell him on the idea of shooting this film. He simply said, I always loved the book, always wanted to make a movie of it or film it, and I'd be delighted to go to India with you. He was my number one first choice for filming it. So he brought his son, who was a young teenager, and his first film, the son, as he ever worked in the movie business, and a crew of 3 Swedish men, a focus puller, cameraman. He was the lighting cameraman, Sven, and another man who was a grip. And the 3 of them came out. They were the Swedish segment of the film. Then I had an English crew. I also had an entire Indian crew. And in the end, it was it was the survival of the fittest. The English all were sent back. The Indians took over the jobs of the English who were sent back, and the Swedes never once flinched. They were like Vikings. They went straight through. And it was a great privilege to work with them, because they are marvelous technicians and very dedicated to the art of film. The way he could handle women, the lighting with the women, and also just the fact that with only black and white they were able to convey so many different moods and so many aspects. I thought if you got him to shoot in color, this would be extraordinary stuff. And it was true. It was liberating for him to be able to work in color, and in a totally different context. Well, because of the nature of the book, Siddhartha, and the fact that Kamala, who is a courtesan after all, almost pulls him off his dedication to being a sadhu. In other words, his dedication to the holy life, the life of self-discipline, the life of denial, denial of the senses. It was the fact that he had been fasting and in the forest for 7 years before he met her, that she was able to break all of these vows and to change his life completely by making him a householder and to bringing him, as a matter of fact, into money making, into consumerism, to all of the things that the material world holds for anyone who becomes involved in it. And in order to convey this, it was important that their scenes, particularly the sexual scenes, had some sort of real energy and power. And of course this was in direct opposition to contemporary Indian cinema, who never show these sort of things. Although Indians are basically quite a sexy race, and certainly they invented the Kama Sutra, and they invented so many aspects of the sexual life that it's a bit hypocritical, but that's the way the Indian cinema is. It is heavily censored, and prior to my shooting this scene, because it was not to be shown in Hindi, and because it was going to be in the English language, and predominantly for the American market, we were allowed to shoot certain things that they would have never allowed in the Indian cinema. However, obviously the actors had trouble with this because they had never done anything like this. And so I ended up with the first lovemaking scene in Indian cinema, and the first kiss on the screen, or series of kisses, and the first time passion had ever been shown in exactly that way.